right, good evening. Good evening. How's everybody doing tonight? Doing great. All right, I heard great. All right, everybody else doing great? Yes, very good, very good. Well, it's good to see each and every one of you this night, Wednesday night here at Tar Landing Baptist Church. Any praises tonight? Any praises? Come on now, Patrick. You got to give it. Yes.
I found out we're having a daughter, and everything's healthy, and just praise the Lord. She's due in December, and we're looking forward to it.
Amen. So Patrick, Bree her and the baby are healthy, and they found out this week. Was it today? Monday. Little girl. All right. Yes. That's right. Yes. Won't be a knuckleheaded boy. It'll be a little girl, right? All right. Hey, I love boys, by the way. So if you got one, they're not all knuckleheads, I promise. So, all right. Any other praises? All right. What about prayer requests? I have a few up here on the sheet, but do you have any? Yes, ma'am. Mr. Neal has an unspoken. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Problems with my back.
Miss Linda's having problems with her back.
One of my coworkers is retiring and getting ready to go through that whole transition. Just pray for peace and be open to what God has going to happen.
Yes. So a coworker in the Marine Corps, getting ready to retire, getting ready to transition to the civilian life again. So pray for him as he's transitioning. For those who have been there, you know exactly what's ahead for him. So, all right, yes, ma'am.
I have several members of my family that has the virus. They're not around here, so I'm not really exposed to it. But
All right, so some family members of Miss Goulds has the virus, COVID. So pray for them. All right. Some that have been given this week so far, Miss Dorothy Marshburn is having a heart catheterization sometime today. We haven't heard back, but that was supposed to be sometime today. Continue to remember Brother Roy Jarman. So he's still dealing with health issues. So continue to lift him up. Miss Dell Swinson had a heart test today. Haven't heard any more on that. Remember a Miss Elizabeth Ford. She's recovering from a stroke. Janet Lease, which is Brother Jim's sister-in-law, she had a stroke recently. We do have a praise. Most of you know Stuart Simpson, right next door at Simpson Brothers. He's doing much better. What I'm hearing, he's improving. Still not, they don't have a diagnosis, but he's improving. If you would, continue to remember Brother Raymond. I haven't heard an update today, but the updates I've heard recently is he continues to improve a little bit each day. He's not in ICU anymore. He's doing a lot of therapy. So have you heard anything different, Tina? I see you shaking your head.
they're showing him pictures of family to help with his mind, and they say that's part of the concussion. But yeah, he's coming along.
All right, so he's still improving, so continue to remember him. And then, of course, Miss Barbara and her family with the passing of her brother this past week, Tim Avery. So remember them. What else? Brother Lynn's procedure went well on Monday. He came home yesterday. I have not heard today how he's doing, but as far as I can tell, as far as I know, everything went very well. So pray for his continued recovery. And it was heart-related. So what else? Anything else? No other needs, praises? All right.
I spoke to Bob and Pam today. They're doing well. They left Wyoming, and while they were there, between them and some other folks that were helping them out up there, I think they said they didn't have an exact count, but roughly 5,000 gospel tracts been handed out since they got up there. So just pray that those, do the Lord's work and people read it. And, Holy Spirit does this thing.
Yes. Yes. Very good. So he spoke with Bob and Pam, and They've handed out quite a few tracts. He said about 5,000 gospel tracts in Wyoming area. So I know they got some other areas they're going to serve in. Be praying for them. I think they want to go to Washington, D.C. Sometime around Labor Day. So just be in prayer for them as they work across the country to take the gospel to America. So, anything else?
Robert, I had several telephone calls today and reminded me about my birthday and also the number I had. I can't figure it all out. He lived me here 91 years.
All right, today. Y'all tell him happy birthday. That's right. Happy birthday. Very good. 91. All right. You're still young. Very good. Well, happy birthday, sir.
It's all about him.
Amen. Amen. Well, very good. Anybody else got a birthday today? All right. All right. Anything else? All right. If not, I'm going to ask Brother Ben Flowers. Would you mind opening us tonight in prayer, brother? Thank you.
Heavenly Father, thank you so very much for the privilege we have to be able to gather together around the word, Lord. We thank you, Father God, for who you are to us, Lord, and the things that you do in our life. Lord, there's so many from our congregation that are in need, Father. As these have been mentioned, Father, Lord, Lynn Saskey, Brother Ray, Lord Roy, just so many others dealing with the health issues, Father. We pray grace upon them. And that as the brother mentioned, that you by your Holy Spirit work in these matters, look again, glory to the name of Jesus Christ. Thank you for our time around your word, Lord. We pray that you same Holy Spirit to teach us, and that we would have humble, hungry, teachable spirits as we come to you. In Christ's name.
Amen. All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right. If you will, take your Bibles, open up to Joshua chapter 1. Joshua chapter 1. If you don't have a handout, there's some back there on the podium. Those will be helpful to you. We're going to cover all 24 chapters tonight. Last week we did the overview of Joshua, so if you were here, you got the primary content of an overview. The theme I've given Joshua is at the top of your handout. God conquers, God gives, and Israel must respond by living according to the book of the law. So remember, just real quick context, Moses has just died. God has brought the children of Israel to the east side of the Jordan River. They're across from Jericho. The book of Deuteronomy shows us that Moses has given the law to them again. It's not a second law, it's just a second giving of the law. They've reestablished that covenant with God. They've assured Moses and God that they're going to obey. Moses again has died, and now Joshua has been commissioned. God has charged him and commanded him to be strong and courageous and to lead the people into battle, into the land that he's going to give them. So that's kind of where we are. They're on the doorstep of crossing the Jordan River, going into the Promised Land. Now, why is that important? Think through history. Think where we started in Genesis. Specifically, go to Genesis 12, Genesis 15, and Genesis 17. What would God promise a guy named Abram? That he was going to make his descendants plentiful, correct? But he was also going to give him what? A land. Did Abram or Abraham get to see that land? No. But who would see what God had promised? His descendants. Well over 1 million of them. I would say that's a pretty good offspring, right? His family has indeed multiplied. All right, so that's kind of where we are. So Joshua chapter 1, I told you there's the structure of Joshua breaks down into 4 parts. The first, we covered real briefly last week. I'll go over it again. Joshua's commission. In chapter 1, we see that Joshua is commissioned. God commissions him in verses 1 through 5. In verses 6 through 9, we read those verses last week. I won't reread them tonight, though. In there, 2 different times, he commands him to be strong and courageous. And tucked in the middle of that, in verse 8, he tells him that this book of the law shall not what? Depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night. That way you be careful to do all that is written in it. And then your way would be prosperous and you would have good success. Remember that? All right, so he's commanding there. And at the end of chapter 1, we see Joshua commands Israel to prepare for crossing the Jordan and for battle. So God prepared Joshua with his commission and the command, and Joshua turned around and did what? Prepared Israel. He's being a leader. So that's the first part of the book of Joshua. The second part is Israel's conquest of the promised land. And that takes you from chapter 2 all the way through chapter 12. And what do we see in these verses? We see that God fights for Israel and brings the nations into submission and the promised land into their promised inheritance. So what do we see in chapter 2? Man, it's a story that you probably remember, Rahab and the spies, right? Anybody remember that? Out of reading through the Old Testament, it's probably one of those accounts that sticks in your memory. So in chapter 2, Joshua sends a couple spies across the river into Jericho to spy out the town, to bring back a report. And we understand that in this process, what does Rahab do? It's on your handout. She trusts Yahweh. Now I know your mind first wanted to go to Rahab lied, didn't it? How many? Confession time. Anybody want to say, well, Rahab lied? All right, yeah. Well, if we're not careful, we tend to focus on Rahab concealed the truth over Rahab trusted in the Lord. What do we see there? Rahab's loyalty is no longer to that earthly king. Rahab's loyalty is now to who? The King of Kings, to the Lord, to Yahweh himself. So that's what we really need to take from chapter 2 there, that Rahab trusts Yahweh and hides the Israelite spies. Why is that? Who was she more afraid of, the king on earth or the king in heaven? The king in heaven. That is the importance that we see right there. Not that she concealed some truth, is that she trusted God. She was more afraid of the king in heaven. What else do we see? The Israelite spies promised to protect Rahab and her family. You remember that account? We don't have time to read the whole chapter, but in chapter 2, she's like, look, I've hid you. You're going out the back way. Only do me one favor. Spare me and my family. And what do they say? Tie this red sash in the window when we come. And anybody that's of your household that remains in here will be protected. However, if they go out, the blood is on their head. Remember that? Yes. So the Lord honors Rahab because she honored him. All right. So that's chapter 2. Now chapter 3. What do we see? God cuts off the waters of the Jordan River so that Israel can pass over on dry land. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like something that has happened in the past? All right. So think, what generation is in Israel right now? The first generation after the Exodus? No, what's happened to them? They died in Numbers, in the book of Numbers. 40 years those died, except for Joshua and Caleb and Moses for a little bit of time, but Moses is dead now. All right. So there's only 2 that was older than 20 years old that survived that. But maybe there was some small children that remembers when the Red Sea was parted. Well, now you have it again. You have the Jordan River being parted. One of the things I wanted to know, when you read chapter 3, it talks about the Ark of the Covenant. And what stepped down, or who stepped down into the river first? The Levites or the priest carrying what? The Ark of the Covenant. Why is that significant? What did the Ark of the Covenant represent? God, especially his presence, especially when it was in the tent of meeting. I just want to point that out. Who went before them? God. God was with them. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4. They come up out of the river. They walked on dry land. It makes a point to specify that. Joshua, who wrote this, they didn't walk on muddy ground. They walked on dry land. All right, have you ever tried to separate water from the ground? Is it dry? No, it's muddy, right? Well, they walked on dry land. That's what Yahweh does. So what do? In chapter 4, they set up a memorial of stones is built to remind all of Israel and the generations to come of the Lord's wonders. To remind them that Israel passed over on dry ground in verse 22. Have you caught on to that in the Old Testament? how Israel would set up those stones, 12 stones, one for each tribe, as a memorial. Have you caught on to that? Why was those memorials set up? So that their children and their grandchildren and the generations would come, or to come, would look at those stones and say, why is that there? And they would say, because Yahweh did this. Because Yahweh did that. Because He's mighty. So that's chapter 4. And we see at the end of that, look at chapter 4, look at verse 23 and 24 in chapter 4. It says, for the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan River for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which He dried up for us until we passed over. So that, there's a purpose clause coming, all the peoples of the earth may know. Did you catch that? That's the first part. So all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty. That's the first part of it. That, there's the other purpose, you may fear the Lord your God forever. What did God want those memorials, those stones to show them? He wanted all the pagan nations to know that He was Yahweh and He had a mighty hand. And He wanted Israel, which they already knew His might, He wanted them to do what? Fear Him. Fear Him. Now we'll see as we go through the book of Joshua, most of the nations around begin to fear Him. All right, we'll see that. So that's chapter 4. We enter into chapter 5. We see the Amorites and the Canaanites, they're distressed over Israel and the Lord. We see that the Lord reestablishes circumcision with Israel, that the Israelite men are circumcised, reminding them of the covenant with God and that they are holy unto Him. So it kind of appears in those years that they wandered around in the book of Numbers that circumcision wasn't taking place in that generation at that point. So Joshua reestablishes that. We can say God reestablishes that. Remember, that was a sign of the covenant. All right. So they do that. Israel again in chapter 5, they celebrate the Passover. It appears that maybe there was a period of time they didn't celebrate the Passover. They re-celebrate that. Look at verse 12 here. They pass over the Jordan River. They enter into Canaan. Now, they hadn't gone to battle yet. They haven't claimed any land or any city or any territory. But what does it say? And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. Why is that significant? Stop and think about it. Who provided the manna in the wilderness? God. And as soon as they entered into the land that God had promised them, He cut the manna off. And they began to eat what? The fruit of the land that He had promised. Who was going to provide them the land? Who was going to provide them the fruit of the land? God. You see the transition? You see how Joshua's that bridge? Joshua's that transition from Israel wandering around in the wilderness to Israel actually occupying the land, living in the land. Joshua's that bridge there. So we see that in chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. Joshua encounters the commander of the Lord's army. Let me read these verses. I love these verses. It's some of my favorite verses in Joshua to read. So verse 13 through 15 of chapter 5. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with this drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us, or are you for our adversaries? You get what he's saying, right? He's like, are you for us, or are you for them? Are you on our team, or are you on their team? You got the picture of the conversation, right? Wonderful. We've asked things like that. Are you for my team? Are you for Bama, or are you for Auburn? All right? I can't help you for Auburn. We need a little counseling here. All right? You on my team, you're on their team. And then look at verse 14. And he said, this is the commander of the Lord's army, no. He didn't say, man, Joshua, I'm with y'all. I'm pulling for you. He didn't say, I'm with them. He said what? Nope. Nope. You got it all wrong. No. No. What else does he go on to say? But I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, What does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, Take off your sandals from your feet. Does that sound familiar? Who else did that? Moses. For the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. So notice their conversation. Joshua, is you with them or you with us? And he just simply says, No, but I'm here now. And then what did Joshua do? What did Joshua do in verse 15? He fell down and he worshiped him. You know what I think of this? When Joshua asked him, Are you on our team or are you on their team? And the commander of the Lord's army said no. You know what I think he's telling Joshua? Joshua, you need to be on my team. I ain't on your side and I'm not on their side. You need to be on my side. That's significant. And when Joshua heard that, he worshiped. Whose side are you on? God's on the right side. He'll always be on the right side. The question is, whose side are you on? Are you with him? Or are you with them? You got to answer that, don't you? So we see that wonderful interaction there. That's chapter 5. Then we enter into chapter 6 in the fall of Jericho. We see in verse 1, I won't read it, but Jericho is afraid of Israel and Yahweh. What else do we see? We see that the commander of the Lord's army, the Lord gives instructions for taking the city of Jericho. What are those instructions? I won't read the verses, but you got it on the handout there. They are to march around the city once for 6 days with no speaking. So for 6 days in a row, once each day, close your mouth, don't say a word, march around the city. What do you think the people in Jericho are thinking? You folk crazy, right? Cray. A little bit crazy, right? On the 7th day, you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priest will blow the trumpets of rams. Israel shall shout with a great shout, and the walls of the city shall fall flat. In that, we know that they will go in, that Rahab and her family shall be spared. They are not to take the devoted things that are devoted or set for destruction. We'll talk about that in a minute. The gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron are to go into the treasury of the Lord. Israel was to devote that city of Jericho, the Canaanites, to complete destruction, including young and old, ox, sheep, and donkeys. Now, I don't know if I have it on your handout, but I have the question, why? Why? Is that ever going through your mind? Why? Why destroy them all? Some of the cities, some of the people, they were allowed to take in as their servants. Others, though, they were devoted to complete destruction. Here's what we need to remember. Think back to Genesis, think back to Exodus, think back to Leviticus, think back to Numbers and Deuteronomy so far. God is holy and His people are to be what? Holy. God is holy and His people are to be holy and distinct. Israel would be tempted to go after false gods of the pagans, especially the Canaanites. And they had already done damage to Israel throughout their history with luring Israel away from Yahweh. God didn't want Israel to be tempted to go after those false gods and pagans. Israel must be in awe of God and not their false gods. God, who is the judge of all the earth, will always do what is right. And while our minds get hung up on details such as this, we have to remember God is holy, and He said His people would be holy. And they were to do away with those things that would make them unholy. That there was a period of time that these people who were pagans, who hated God, ran out of time. And it is hard to think about that, isn't it? Let's just be honest, it is. But God in His love and His mercy and His sovereign care, His providential plan, decided the city of Jericho would be devoted to destruction. And Israel was to carry that out. So that's primary chapter 6. We can read verses, we won't read them, but in verses 22 through 25 of chapter 6, Rahab and her family are spared. At the end of the chapter, Joshua curses Jericho. He's like, cursed be the person that tries to reestablish this city. Now, one thing to note, you can see it several times in chapter 6. The Ark of the Covenant is mentioned 4 times. Why is that important? 4 different times throughout the instructions to walk around the city, the Ark of the Covenant is mentioned, that it would go in the front. Why is that important? For Israel, they had a tangible way to see that God was what? With them. It was a representation to remind them that God is with us. All right, chapter 7, we get into Israel and Achan. He has sinned against God and they're defeated. Verses 1 through 5. They go up, man, the spies come back and say, Joshua, don't send up all the guys to fight. They're not many. Just send up a couple thousand. We can handle it. They go up to fight, and what happens? They get defeated, they tuck tail and they run. And the people of Ai chase a good number of them down and kill them. And then Joshua falls on his face and is like, God, Yahweh, Lord, why is this? What has happened? Why this? And the Lord reveals to him in chapter 7 that someone had sinned against Yahweh. Now we know the account, we know the chapter. It was Achan. Achan sinned and he'll be punished, him and his family. Do you remember that? They were stoned and burned to death. What is the big deal? Achan took things that were devoted to destruction. What is the big deal? Remember Achan took them, he hid them. Joshua, the Lord would reveal tribe by tribe, family by family, who was at fault. Of course, Achan was the one. But what's the big deal with the devoted things? These things would turn the heart of Israel away from the Lord and would cause them to go after other things, that is, to covet. Remember again, over and over, Israel is to be holy, distinct unto God. The devoted things that were to be destroyed would become idols in the hearts of Israel, and God didn't want that. That's why this was such a big deal. So we see that's chapter 7. Now chapter 8, we see the fall of Ai. Israel goes and they defeat Ai by the mighty hand of God, verses 1 through 29. What happens after that? Joshua and Israel build an altar. They offer sacrifices unto the Lord, and they read the law for all of Israel to hear again. They're paying tribute at the end of chapter 8 to God. All right, so that's the first conquest there. That's Jericho and Ai. That's directly across the river. That's where they went first. Now we go into the southern region in chapters 9 through 10. And in chapter 9, we see the deception of the Gibeonites and the prayerlessness of the leaders of Israel. We see in chapter 9 that the Gibeonites come together with a few other people. They're totally afraid of Yahweh. They're totally afraid of Israel. They don't want to die, so they concoct this plan. The Gibeonites didn't live that far away from Israel at that time, but they concocted this plan. They put on old clothes. They used old canteens or wine skins. They made themselves look dirty. They made themselves look humble and poor and like they had been traveling for a long while. And they come up to Israel, to Joshua and the leaders of Israel, and they say, we're from a distant land, and we just want a peace treaty with you. And we've brought provisions with us, payment. And what do the leaders do in chapter 9? Let us pray unto God and see what He thinks about this. No. I see a lot of you shaking your head. No, that's not. No, they didn't do that. What did they do? Man, I like that. Yeah. Let's do it. Let's shake on it, right? They go right into a peace treaty. And then what happens? Look at, let's see. Verse 14. It says, so the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. Verse 18. But the people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord. So later on, Israel and Joshua would come to figure out, oh, they deceived us. They're really neighbors. They're just a few miles up the road. And they go back to, why did y'all lie to us? But since they had vowed, they kept their word. What I want us to see right there, do we ever make deals or make decisions without asking the Lord for guidance and wisdom? How often do we do that? A lot, right? Have you ever made a decision and didn't seek the Lord's counsel on it? I know I have. Very, very often. Well, that's what they did. They had to live with the consequences, though, didn't they? All right? They wouldn't get in a fight with the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites would become their servants. But if you keep tracing out Israel's history, they would become a stumbling block to Israel. Why? Because Gibeonites weren't God's people. They weren't holy unto God. They weren't following God. That's not to say all of them. Maybe some of them come into that relationship, but a good portion did not. That's chapter 9. Chapter 10. God pauses the sun. He causes the sun to stop the sun's movement and brings great victory to Israel over her enemies at Gibeon. Not the Gibeonites, but at Gibeon. Why would God do that? Chapter 10, verse 14. Well, let me back up and I'll read verse 12. We'll see Joshua's request. So they've been battling in Gibeon. All day, and night is coming, and Joshua makes this request. At the time, Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jashar? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There has been no day like it before or since, when the Lord heeded the voice of a man. And here's the reason. For the Lord did what? Israel, don't think you've done this. Israel, can you make the sun stop? The Lord fought for Israel. That's why he did it. So we see that. That's chapter 10. We keep going in it. Israel conquers those 5 kings, those 5 cities that had come together. Since the Gibeonites had made a peace treaty, all these other cities like, look, we'll form our armies together and we'll defeat them. Well, Israel conquers those 5 kings. They're listed on your paper. King of Jerusalem, king of Hebron, king of Jarmuth, king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. That happens in chapter 10. Israel moves to the south and fights against, and I'll let you pronounce all those the way you want. All right? So that's chapter 10. Now we roll into chapter 11. Israel's moving to the north. This is the conquest of the northern territory. In chapter 11, we see Israel, by God's mighty hand, defeats the kingdoms and the kings of the northern region. And in chapter 11, verse 20, I like to highlight a few statements. It says, "For it was the Lord's doing." It was the Lord's doing to harden the people's hearts there so that they would fight against Israel and they would be destroyed. It was the Lord's doing that Israel conquered these people. So that's chapter 11. Then chapter 12 is a historical, it's kind of tucked right in the middle of the book of Joshua. You have all these conquests, you got all this battle. Here in a minute, we're going to have all the allotments of the land. And right in the middle of that is this tribute to what God had done through Moses and through Joshua. And you have a record of their victories over the kings. We won't read all those verses. Why do you think that's there? Let me think more than just historical. Why do you think it's there? To remind the Israelites, they need some Prevagen or something, right? Is that memory drug, Prevagen, you hear advertised? Yeah, the Israelites need some Prevagen. You know, it seems like they forget things. And God says, nope, we're going to write it down. Why are we writing it down? Because I don't ever want you to forget. Nope, stack me up 12 stones right here. Why? Because you're going to forget, and I don't want you to forget what I've done. Anybody else ever forgotten anything? Yeah, oh yeah, that's right. So tucked right in there. Oh no. God defeated these by the hand of Moses. God defeated these by the hand of Joshua. Don't ever forget it. All right? So that's the second part of the book of Joshua. The first part, Joshua's commission, Joshua taking charge. The second part is the actual battles, the conquest. Now we get into that third part of the structure. Israel's inheritance of the land is divided among the tribes. Now you got to think back to Exodus, especially Leviticus and Numbers, the book of Numbers, right? God continued to promise that each tribe was going to have an allotment of the land. Do you remember that? Except there was one tribe that would not. Do you remember which one that is? Levites. Why? They belong to God. What portion did they have? The Lord. The Lord was their portion. All right? So that's where we're heading right now. What God had achieved for Israel, Israel will now get to enjoy. Have you ever worked hard at something? I mean, whether it was all day or for days or weeks, some of you, whether it was school or some kind of project at the house or something at work, maybe you put up a pool, and at the end when the water was just right, did you ever just get to enjoy it? Well, guess what Israel's getting ready to do? God had done the fighting. Yes, He used them in it. Now they were getting ready to enjoy the land. So I like to think of these chapters as just a praise unto Yahweh. As the land is being divided up, as the boundaries are being set, they're just praising Yahweh. So in chapter 13, 1 through 7, he lists some land that had not been conquered yet. What is he saying? And this is just my paraphrase here on the handout. Joshua and Israel, there is still work to be done. Don't get comfortable. There's still some regions you have to conquer. There's still some boundaries. There's some fence posts that have to be moved out a little bit more. So don't get comfortable just yet. All right, so that's in chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. What else do we see, though? That the promised land is divided as the Lord commanded. In chapter 13, we see the inheritance of the east. Remember, when I say the word east, or the Bible uses east, it's east of the Jordan River. Remember, there was 2.5 tribes that once they got there in Deuteronomy, Numbers really, and Deuteronomy, they said, you know what, we kind of like it over here. This is good for our livestock. What tribes were those? Do you remember? Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. And their request to Moses was, will you let us have this part of the land and not dwell over on the western part of Israel? And Moses interceded, asked God, and God said that was fine. But what were they to do? That's right. The families and the children remained, but the guys of war were to do what? Go across the Jordan with Israel, and they did, to help conquer the land. So we see that the allotment there, Reuben, Gad, and the half a tribe of Manasseh, that's chapter 13. Chapter 14 through 17 is the inheritance of the west, and we see it divided. Half a tribe of Manasseh, half of them's on the east side of the Jordan, and the other half is on the west side of the Jordan. We see that Judah gets her allotment, and in that, I love chapter 14, how Caleb, he's well over 80 years old at this point. And he says, give me my land. He says, I'm just as strong now as I was at 40 when I went in to spy the land. Back in Numbers. All right, God has sustained that man. All right, so we see the allotment there. Continuing on, inheritance of the west. You got Manasseh, you got Judah, you got Ephraim. Chapters 18 and 19, you got the remaining portions of the land being allotted. One of the things I pointed out last week, though, before the rest of the land is allotted, the tent of meeting would be established in chapter 18, verse 1. Why is that significant? Yahweh's presence, God's presence. I'm here. All right. So you got that going on. The rest of the 7 tribes, land would be divided: Benjamin, Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. Joshua in chapter 19 would get his own, at the end there, his own inheritance. One interesting thing in this chapter, though, well, not in this chapter, but we'll see throughout the chapters, is Israel did not drive out all of the pagans. And we won't turn there, but if you read it in chapter 13, verse 13, chapter 15, verse 63, chapter 16, verse 10, and chapter 17, verse 12, it states that they did not drive those people out. Why is that there, you think? He told them to do it. They didn't do it. Would those people come back to be a problem later? Yes, they would. Remember that. That's important, because when we get into the book of Judges in a couple weeks, we're going to see a lot of those same folks causing troubles for Israel. Why? Israel didn't fully drive them out as they were supposed to. All right, so we see that's chapter 19, chapter 20. We see the cities of refuge. If you'll recall back, especially in the book of Numbers, that there were supposed to be 6 cities of refuge. Remember, those cities were established for the man, the woman that accidentally murdered someone. I'm not using the word killed, but murdered unintentionally. All right, they could flee from where they were to one of these cities of refuge. Their case would be heard there. If they remained in that city of refuge, they could remain alive. If they were to go out of that city of refuge, the person's family of the deceased person could avenge their blood. All right, so God in His grace and His mercy made provision for those who maybe it was just an accidental death. They had provision for that. All right, so that was the cities of refuge. They established those. All right, chapter 21, we see the allotment to the tribe of Levi. Now, the Lord was their portion, but what would they get? I got it on the handout. They would get some cities. In all the areas, in all of Israel, there would be 48 total cities that they would get, and the pasture land for their flocks. Numbers 35:7 specifies that's what they were to get. Now remember from Leviticus that the Levites would not inherit a portion of the land as the other tribes, because the Lord is their portion. The Levites were to be spread out among Israel. This is important. Think back to the book of Exodus and Leviticus. The Levites were kind of guardians of God's holiness. God was to be holy. His people were to be holy. The camp was to be holy. Those things that were unclean were to be taken where? Inside the camp or outside the camp? Outside the camp. Even some of the portions of the sacrifices. If a person became unholy, they were to go outside the camp until they were declared holy or clean. Who declared something clean and unclean? Yes, ultimately God, but who else, humanly speaking, said this is clean, this is unclean, this is holy, this is unholy? Who was it? The priest, the Levites, the high priest and all the Levites, the priests there. What has God done now that they've come into the land and the children of Israel are moving out from one camp where the tent of meeting is the center? They're moving out into all these areas. God has established it to where the Levites would go to these cities and they would protect God's holiness among God's people. What would they do in these cities? That's clean, that's unclean. That's holy, that's unholy. Right? God's doing what? God's protecting His holiness among His people, and He's trying to protect their holiness through the Levites. Does that make sense? That's why you see that. All right, chapter 21, we see at the end there a tribute to the Lord's faithfulness in verses 43 through 45. Let me read those verses in chapter 21. It says, "Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that He swore to give to their fathers. And they took possession of it, and they settled there." The faithfulness of the Lord. He gave every inch. Verse 44, "And the Lord gave them," what does it say? "Rest on every side, just as He had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass." Isn't that beautiful? All of it. Israel, everything I promised in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the book of Joshua has been fulfilled. All of it. Think back to when we covered Genesis chapter 1 in March. That's how long we've been at this now. The same Yahweh that said, let there be blank, and there was blank. The same one that said this, and it was so. Created this with his words, and it was so. Is the same Yahweh that kept all his promises. Have you kept all your promises? No, I know I hadn't either. Yahweh did. So we see this just a tribute to him. Now, chapter 22, we see that Joshua releases the 2.5 tribes from the east to go back to their families. Remember, the men had come over and battled with them. He blesses them and charges them to obey the word of the Lord. Thanks, guys. Have a good day. We'll see you around. All right? That's the beginning of chapter 22. But what else do we see in chapter 2? We see the eastern tribes, that is Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, they build an altar of witness unto the Lord. Interesting, right? Why include that there? Why is that important? Well, the eastern tribes go back. The men, the leaders there, they build this altar. Where was the primary altar for Israel? It was the tent of meeting, right? Okay. But they go over and they build this altar on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And what happens? The western tribes, those other tribes that took the western part of Israel, they hear about it and they get angry because they perceive a turning away from Yahweh. In their mind, they're like, oh, no. They've built this altar over here and they're going to sacrifice to something else. They're turning away from Yahweh. And what do they resolve to do? They're going to go over and find out what's going on, but they say, we're going to put them to death if we need to. Right? Their own kin, their own folks. Right? Well, they go over there. They're zealous for the glory and the honor of Yahweh and for the holiness of his people. But what do they find? When they talk to the eastern tribes' only desire was to honor the Lord and to build the altar, not to sacrifice on it, but to remind their children and the children of the western tribes that they are part of God's holy people. We belong to Yahweh just as the tribes in the west belong to Yahweh. The altar, it says in these verses, was to be a witness between us that the Lord is God. They established an altar as a memorial, not to use it as an altar, but to remind themselves, their families, the generations to come, that they didn't belong to the pagans, they didn't belong to false gods, they belonged to Yahweh. You see how we just went through the allotment of the land real quickly? All right. So now the fourth and final structure is chapters 23 through 24 in Joshua. After the time of rest, 23:1, you see Joshua summoned Israel together and he charged them to obey the Lord. He commands them in chapter 23. Look at verse 6 through 8. Therefore, be very strong to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses. Now, stop and think about that phrase. That's why I have it in the theme. In chapter 1, verse 8, to do careful to all that is written in the law, the book of the law. And at the end of the book, the Joshua who was commanded by Yahweh to keep everything that's in the book of the law, he's turning around and commanding Israel to do what? Keep everything that's in the book of the law. So I think that's why I say Israel must mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods. So swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. So that's a charge to be strong and courageous. Well, what else do we see? Chapter 24. It's a chapter you're probably familiar with. We see a testimony of God's powerful actions on behalf of Israelites. So if you were to roll from verse 1 to 13, God has given another historical account of everything He's done for Israel. And then You get down into verse 14 and we see a charge to choose to serve Yahweh. Look at verse 14 and 15. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve Him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. And the phrase you're familiar with. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua lays that choice out there. Choose Yahweh. And then at the end of chapter 24, we got the death of Joshua. Now, we'll pick up in a couple weeks in the book of Judges, and it will pick up right there just about with the death of Joshua. In fact, the leaders of Israel will be asking, who's going to lead us now? That's the book of Joshua. Last week we did the overview and the some application from Joshua. I don't have any application for you tonight, but how would you apply the book of Joshua to your life? Or let me ask this, if you had to sum up the book of Joshua to a friend, a coworker, how would you summarize it? I asked you last week, who is the main character in the book of Joshua? God. It's not Joshua. Joshua was a servant. God's the main character. Who went before them? Think of the Ark of the Covenant. Who fought for them? Who gave them? Who provided for them? Who protected them? Who was faithful to them? It was God. God's the main character. And He was faithful, even when they weren't. All right, so that's the book of Joshua. How does it tie into Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? What God had promised, God has kept. What God has promised, God has kept. A lot of years have passed, hasn't it? A lot of generations have died. Not His promises. Well, those things that God has promised us, will He keep them? Yeah. For those who call on the name of the Lord, they will be saved. He keeps that promise. For those who love Him and serve Him and follow Him and fear Him, He'll keep His promises. But you know, there's another promise out there. To those who reject Him, they stand condemned. That's a promise too. How about you? Where you sit? I pray the book of Joshua has been a blessing to you. God bless you, and in a couple weeks we'll start Judges. Have a good night.